Follow the water. That is the mantra that prehistoric man used to live under. And speaking of water, the River Nile. It's one of the longest rivers in the world, if not the longest. Some people argue the Amazon, if you really check it out, might be longer than the River Nile, but who cares? That's not the impressive part. If you look at the River Nile, it starts from Lake Victoria and it snakes its way up through the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Sudan, and then it goes into Egypt. This long snake has something about it that is bigger than other rivers in Africa, which is that the people living amongst or living around the river seem to share a certain heritage from the top to the bottom. But let's get into it. If we look into the delta, that's the region written Cairo going up to Alexandria, that area. Lots of Greeks and Romans wrote about the fact that that area called the delta, a delta man, was dominated by Nubians. And then parts of Egypt during the time of the Romans were dominated by Nubians. You go down to Sudan, and we know that that part was dominated by Nubians. Nubians is a term I use for the dark skinned people of East Africa, the Nilotics. But I don't want to confuse you by saying Nilotic. You keep going down and up and around, and the Sudanese area, Nilotic, South Sudan, Nilotic, Democratic Republic of Congo. There's evidence that the people who were living in this area before the Bantu people came were Nilotic, and the people in Uganda were Nilotic. The people living in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and those places before the big expansion too were both Nilotic and another group, but Nilotics were there. And we can see here, if we follow this route, clearly, the consistency here is that Nilotics were living amongst these areas and they consistently traversed them, and there must have been wars about certain areas. So, of course, the question is, why build a civilization at the tippiest point of this place? Well, that's a question for another day. But if we look at the Middle East, there is no real incentive, at least not at all times, to move into Africa. It's not really a river, not really anything, but some people speculate that when the sun shifts and then everything becomes green again, some parts of the Middle East and Africa, which are always joined, they suddenly become a route in which the people from the Middle East can take into Africa. And I'm not even against that. What I'm against is the idea that these Nilotics who live, and we have evidence for this, everywhere in the Nile were not the people responsible for living in the Nile. Especially areas like Cairo and Alexandria, where they were living in them even when other people came there. It's even possible that from this area they hopped out and lived in parts of the Middle East as with the same ethnic or racial breakdown as other people who lived in the Nilotic regions, and that they met other people from the Middle East who lived further away. Now, if you don't watch my previous video, I'm going to have to break it down for you. Afroasiatic languages, they tend to start by this area right here next to Egypt, and then the rest of them are in Africa. The small region here next to Egypt, and then the rest are in Africa. Only later do they start to expand and go down to places like Yemen and other places, and then during the later times, really closer to our times than any other time, they spread throughout the Middle East and Europe and other places in the whole world. But for the most part, they spent the majority of their history in Africa and only one sliver, one point outside of Africa. The Y haplogroup E1B1B is mostly associated with Afroasiatic regions. You can see there that the darkest regions are East Africa, right? That's where they think it originated from. And then it's distributed all the way in North Africa, Sudan, parts of West Africa, the tippy tops of West Africa, and all the way down to Southern Africa. You see these regions right here. And we know that these regions have really only one thing in common, which is the possibility of Afroasiatics moving out from Africa into all of these regions. You can see parts of Southern Europe being touched by this, probably due to the farming expansion from parts of the Middle East. But you can see the part of the Middle East that has this the most is the part that's straddled by Africa, the part that's grasped or adjacent to Africa. And you can see that the areas of the Middle East where the oldest civilizations were, the Omani areas, the Sumerian areas, the other civilizations, they're barely touched by this, even though they are touched. But if you go inside Africa, you go to Egypt, you go to Somalia, you go to Sudan, and you also some places, if you go to South Africa, you can see a whole line. Now, a genetic study was done in 2018, and this is what they had to say about this haplogroup. Oh, before the study, we have to first consider the fact that you can see here that it's distributed from East Africa because there's parts of Africa that are also untouched by this. And of course, if you look in Asia and Europe, there's huge parts that are untouched as well. So this is how we know that it's a more of an East African phenomena than a West African phenomena. The study says we investigated the genetic history of Southern African populations with a special focus on their paternal history. We re examined previous claims that the Y chromosome haplogroup E1B1B EM293 was brought to Southern Africa by pastoralists from Eastern Africa and investigated patterns of sex biased gene flow in Southern Africa. We analyzed previously published complete mitochondrial DNA, genome sequence, and 900 kb of NRY sequences from 23 populations from Namibia, Botswana, and Zambia, as well as haplogroup frequencies from large samples of Southern African populations and 23 loci newly genotyped Y-link STR loci for the samples assigned to haplogroup E1B1B. Our results support an Eastern African origin for Y chromosome haplogroup E1B1B EM293. However, its current distribution in Southern Africa is not strongly associated with pastoralism, suggesting more complex demographics, events, and/or changes in subsistence practices in this region. The Bantu expansion in southern Africa had a notable genetic impact and was probably a rapid male dominated expansion, or a finding of a significant increase in the intensity of the sex biased gene flow from north to south may reflect changes in the social dynamics between Khoisan and Bantu groups over time. Now, I want to remind you that these regions here, Elam, Sumer, Dilmun, Magan, Marashi, and Melahu, which is um, Afghanistan, India, Oman, the UAE, and so on, these places did not speak Afroasiatic languages until you started seeing Akkadians and people like that who came from further west, come this direction, come from parts of Africa and move this way into the Sumerian regions. You do not see that. And so you see that the Afro-Asiatic people have nothing to do with those people in terms of language or anything like that, in terms of genetics, in terms of any of that. And so the civilization here is completely isolated. It's completely its own thing, away from anything that's happening in Africa. And then later on, there's a movement. But it's not just this, it also has to do with genetics, language, but not only that, the River Nile, as we were talking about, that you can see the root, as the genetics say, that there was a complex thing going on of human beings moving down south from East Africa somehow, which probably went through traveling through the oceans, but also the River Nile and getting so far south that when the Bantu people came, they carry some of the DNA of those people, but only the DNA of East Africans, as people who are Bantu lack any DNA from Eurasia or Arabia or any place like that. And in conclusion, let us think about what these people accomplished and did and distributed themselves so far in the world that today it's complicated to even know what they were doing. So, like, share, subscribe. Let's try to get 300 likes. I've noticed that I can't get past 100 for some reason.